Well, hello everyone. I'm glad you joined me tonight, and thankful that you can be part of the study tonight. For our kids, I need you to get just one piece of paper tonight, and if you have some colored pencils, that would be good, or you can just use your regular pencil, and I'll guide you through what we're going to do tonight. When you get your piece of paper all set, I want you to draw a crown, like Miss Jody has got there for me. And I want you to have it with 7 different prongs coming out of the top. So I want you to draw a crown with 7 different prongs. Don't pay attention to this stuff yet. We'll work with that as we go through the story. So get your piece of paper and draw a crown with 7 different prongs on it. So today, we're going to study a big chunk. 2 Samuel chapter 1 through 2 Samuel chapter 10. Now, as I look at the lessons that have been assigned, or the objective that's been assigned for this lesson, it's supposed to be about loyalty. And I must admit, I worked on this lesson, and finally today, this afternoon, it hit me where all the loyalty in the book was found. So I hope I can convey that to you in a good way today. First of all, when you think about loyalty, I want to begin with the loyalty that David had to Saul and to Jonathan. So in your first prong, I want you to draw a heart. I want you to draw a heart. And that's to be a sign, that's to indicate the loyalty that David had to Saul and Jonathan. As 1 Samuel closes, remember Saul is in a battle with the Philistines. They chase them down. Saul is struck with an arrow. And when his armor bearer refuses to finish taking his life, you have Saul falling on his own sword. Well, as a result of that, the Philistines take his body, and they're not very nice to him. They take his head off and they nail his body to a wall. And David hears about that. You find this in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel 1. David hears about that, and he is so torn up about it. It just really crushes him to know that Saul and Jonathan have been treated that way. You know, through the years, maybe the last 10 years, possibly the last 10 years, it's hard to be absolute about it. Maybe the last 10 years, David's been on the run from Saul. Saul has been angry at him. He's tried to throw a spear at him, pin him against the wall. And David's had a couple of opportunities to take Saul's life. But David said, I'll not touch God's anointed. Well, when the battle takes place and Saul is killed, you have this Amalekite that comes and tells David that he has killed Saul. He brings also some of the prized possessions that were there, and to show David that he killed Saul. Well, that Amalekite might have thought he was going to be rewarded for what he did. But instead, David said, you have touched or killed God's anointed. Saul was God's anointed, and you have killed him. Now, a sidebar, backing up, had Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 15, when Jordan covered that lesson where the ends don't justify the means, had he finished his job like he was supposed to, this Amalekite might not have been there. But nonetheless, he's present here, and he comes and he seems to think with David he's going to get a great reward. And instead, David tells his men to take him and to take his life because he has touched God's anointed. David's loyalty to Saul and to Jonathan, no matter how bad Saul treated David, David never became disloyal to Saul. And you see now in the time of his death, the loyalty that Saul had, that David has to Saul and Jonathan. Second thing that we see is in chapter 2. We see this in chapter 2, and we see it beginning in verse 1. He says, it happened after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to the cities of Judah And the Lord said, go up. David said, where shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. So David goes there. First of all, I want you to see David's loyalty to God. Here and in chapter 5, in fact, just listen to me just a moment. I'll turn to chapter 5 and verse 19. So David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up against the Philistines? Then verse 23, David inquired of the Lord. He said, you shall not go up, circle around behind them, come up behind them in the front of the mulberry tree. You see what David's doing? David is inquiring of the Lord. Here is David's loyalty to God. Now, I think that's one thing that God saw in David back in 1 Samuel chapter 16 that we talked about. Whenever you have Eliab, Abinadab, and Shema that come through the house, and they look like kings, but God says, no, they're not the men. And then God says, I look at the heart, I don't look at the outward appearance. I think God knew that David would be loyal to him. At this point in time in David's life, he is loyal to him. And before David acts, he does something that all of us should do, and that is he inquired of the Lord. But there's also another act of loyalty right after this. Back in 1 Samuel chapter 31, when the men of Jabesh Gilead hear what has happened to Saul and to Jonathan and to the other sons of Saul, they go and they retrieve their bodies and they bring them back for a proper burial. They demonstrate a loyalty to Saul and to Jonathan and to David. And David praises them for this. Listen to what he says about this. The men of Jabesh Gilead were the ones who buried Saul. So David sent messengers to the house of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, you are blessed of the Lord, for you have shown kindness to your Lord, to Saul, and have buried him. And now may the Lord show kindness to you. I will also repay you this kindness because you have done this thing. So whatever relationship was with Jabesh Gilead and Saul and his sons or David, here they act loyally. They act very loyally to Saul. And so you have David's loyalty to God. He inquires of God, and you have these men that act loyal to Saul as well. I think there's something else that you see as an act of loyalty that David has to God, and that's found in chapter 5 again, as I read in verse 23. As we look at verses 23 through 25, in verse 19, David inquired, can I go up against the Philistines? Are you going to be with me if I go? And God says, yeah, I'm going to be with you. You go ahead and go. I'm going to be with you. But what he tells them to do is to circle behind them. And he says, you don't do anything until you hear the rustling in the trees. When you hear the rustling in the trees, then you'll know that it's time to do something. Well, the rustling in the trees, I think, is heaven walking in the trees. God's army walking in the trees. And David and his army hear heaven walking in the trees. And when they hear that, the attack begins. Well, they're behind, so all the Philistines turn and run the other way. Well, guess who they meet the other way? They meet the Lord. They meet the Lord, and they are ultimately defeated. But notice what David did first. David's loyalty to God before he went into battle. Before he goes up to Hebron, he inquires of the Lord. Before he goes into battle, he inquires of the Lord. Here are important decisions in the life of David. And before he acts, before he goes up to Hebron and is crowned king of Judah, where he will reign for 7.5 years, he inquires of the Lord. And now, before he goes to the Philistines, he inquires of the Lord. David had a heart for God, and he had a heart that continually sought to appeal to God. And so over the second prong, I want you to draw a little arrow and right up at the top, God. Here we have David's loyalty to Saul and Jonathan, but now here we have David's loyalty to God. Well, as I said, in chapter 2, we also see the loyalty that he has to these men of Jabesh Gilead. So draw you two small men right over that third prong. And so we've seen how David is loyal. But David is also loyal for something else. When that Amalekite came back with news that he had killed Saul, and it's questionable whether he had done that. 1 Samuel 31, it says, Saul fell on his sword and he was dead, and the Amalekites cut off his head. So I highly doubt that this Amalekite that shows up before David was instrumental in taking Saul's life. He just wants the reward. But here I want you to see David has loyalty toward innocent blood. And so here I want you to draw a shield and a spear. A shield and a spear, because that represents the fighting that takes place. David was loyal to innocent blood. Another time that we see that is in chapter 8. In chapter 8, you see the story of Benah and Rechab. And what they've done is they're going to go into the house of Ishbosheth, and that should be chapter 4 rather, not chapter 8. They're going to go into the house of Ishbosheth, and they're going to kill Ishbosheth. Now, at this point in time, Abner's already dead. He was the captain of Saul's army. And he's installed Ishbosheth kind of as a puppet king, because Abner really intends to run the show until he does something wrong and Ishbosheth confronts him about it. Then he turns and he runs to David. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But here Benah and Rechab, while Ishbosheth is asleep, taking a nap, they go in and they kill him. Now, keep in mind, Ishbosheth was the lone surviving son of Saul. And so therefore, he would have been the representative of Saul. He's the closest thing to Saul, and therefore would have been considered a threat to David, because Saul's been a threat to David. And so these men sneak in and they take the life of Ishbosheth. And they bring his head to David. And again, I guess they were expecting a reward, because look, what we've done is we brought the head of Ishbosheth to David. Here's the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. And the Lord has avenged my Lord, the king, this day of Saul and his descendants. Notice what they're doing. They're attributing this to the Lord. The Lord didn't have anything to do with this. The Lord didn't have anything to do with him going in and murdering Ishbosheth. In fact, they come to David and they present the fact that Ishbosheth they have taken his life. And again, as I said, I guess they're accepting a reward. But instead, David has respect for innocent blood. So he will say in verse 11, how much more, when wicked men have killed a righteous person in his own house or his own bed, therefore shall I now require his blood at your hand and remove you from the earth? So David commanded his young men, and they executed him and cut off their hands, their feet, and hanged them by the pole in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner in Hebron. So they take it and they bury him next to Abner. Do you see David? David protected innocent life. David was loyal to innocent life. David would not tolerate, for someone's own reward, the taking of innocent life. Now, put a peg there, because at the end of the story, we're going to come back to this. The next thing that I think you see in chapter 6 is you see David's loyalty to Jerusalem and the Ark of the Covenant. Now David is both king of Israel and king of Judah. In fact, you see that happening in the first part of chapter 5. And so David is going to reign 33 years over Israel and Judah both. He's already reigned 7.5 years over Judah. And so now he has both the northern area and the southern area. Now he's over all of Israel, all of Judah. Well, now David is king. What happened when Saul was fighting the Philistines? They took the Ark of the Covenant. David wants the Ark of the Covenant back. And so David is going to go to Kiriath-Jearim, and he is going to bring the Ark of the Covenant back. Here you see David is loyal to Jerusalem and the Ark of the Covenant. What is Jerusalem? Jerusalem is called the city of David. Here's the place where God's going to record his name, and here's the place where ultimately Solomon's going to build the temple. But here's where David is living. Here's where the seat of his throne is. It's the city of David. And David wants the presence of God with him. And so he goes to take the ark. And so you see his loyalty. You see the loyalty that he had toward God in this. David is still loyal toward God in this. He's still loyal toward God all the way through this, all the way in this story. Now keep in mind what we talked about last week with 1 Samuel chapter 16 and 17. You had the battle with David and Goliath, and David was loyal to God there. And David is still demonstrating that loyalty to God. He's the man God wants ruling his kingdom. And he's going to make a covenant with David in just a moment. And so, they bring the Ark of the Covenant back. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. The next way that David demonstrates his loyalty is he proposes to Nathan to build a house for God. So over this next prong, sixth prong, I want you to build a house. He proposes to build a house for God. Why? Well, by this time, David is strong, and David is mighty, and David is powerful. He has whipped everybody he's gone up against. In fact, he has now whipped the Philistines. And he's going to whip the Moabites, which, by the way, his great-grandmother was a Moabite, Ruth. David is now powerful. David is now wealthy. David is now very prosperous, very strong. And he looks, and he lives in a house of cedar. Now, that may not impress us much, but that would have been like a mansion back then. Just imagine a mansion, and that's what that would have looked like. And David looked at that, and then he looked at the temple out his window and said, I'm living in this mansion here, and God's still worshipped in this temple, or in this tabernacle, in this tent. So what I'm going to do, Nathan, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a house for God. And Nathan, first of all, said, I think that's a great idea. Oops. At this point, David jumps ahead of God. At this point, he did not inquire of God. But you still see the loyalty to God, because he wants to build a house for God. It's not right that David lived in this mansion and God worshiped in tents. And so then God speaks to Nathan and says, whoa, time out here. Whoa, time out. Let's reevaluate this thing. Hey, David, I appreciate this. I appreciate you thinking about it. And I really thank you for all your sincere heart and thought that you've given into this, but that's not going to happen right now. You're not going to be the one that's going to build the house. Your son is going to build the house. Well, that has a twofold point to it. Number one, the immediate point is Solomon. Solomon will build the house. But also, Jesus is called the Son of David. When blind Bartimaeus saw him, he said, Son of David. Jesus is also called the Son of David, and ultimately, Jesus is going to build the temple, and by the way, that's me, and that's you. It's a temple built with living stones, and we are the temple of God. Those who are in a saved relationship with God are part of the temple. So what he's saying is, I'm going to establish your dynasty. I'm going to make a covenant with you. Now keep in mind, God had made a covenant with Moses. And right now they're living under the Mosaic covenant, and that's going to continue, but now you have what is called the Davidic covenant, a covenant with David. God makes a covenant with David, and here's the covenant God makes with David. I'm going to establish your dynasty. And all the way up until the Babylonian captivity, when the kings of David end, David's dynasty does not end. The kings of David end. But David's dynasty survives the Babylonian captivity. And you see David's dynasty coming to its full completeness at the birth of Christ. And so he says to David, hey buddy, I love you. I really do. I know you have a heart for me. I know you want me present with you, but you're not going to build a house. Your son coming after you is going to build a house. Now, the reason David can't build a house, we're told in Chronicles, is because he's a man of war. He has blood on his hands. David is a warrior. Solomon's not a warrior. Solomon's a peacemaker with other nations. David's a warrior, and he's got blood on his hands. I mean, look at what happened with the Philistines and the Moabites and the Ammonites, all these nations that he defeats. David is a warrior, and God said, I can't let you do that. But Solomon's going to do that. Now, what David does do from this point on is he goes about and he collects everything that's going to be needed for Solomon to build the temple. In fact, But in chapter 8, some of the bounty, some of the things that are a result of the conquering of the people, they bring back all the jewelry and all the goods, and David says, I tell you what, we're going to set that aside. That's going to be for the Lord. And so he's collecting everything. All Solomon's got to do, because David can't build a house, but he's loyal to God. He wants the house built, and David's going to collect all the material for God. Well, that brings us to another act of loyalty. And we find that in chapter 9 and also the first part of chapter 10. You remember that what takes place whenever the people are fleeing. The nurse of Jonathan's son drops him. You find that in chapter 4. So it says in verse 2, now Saul's son had 2 men who were captains of troops. The name of the one was Benah, the name of the other Rechab, the sons of Ramon the Beerothite of the children of Benjamin, because the Beerothites fled to Gatam and have been sojourners unto this day. Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son who was lame in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. It happened as she made haste to flee, that he fell, became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. So here, they learn about Saul and David. The Philistines have defeated them, and now she's worried. And so she's going to take Jonathan's son, and she's going to hide him. Well, after all the battles are over, David is kind of sitting back and he's reflecting about things. And he begins to wonder, is there anybody else in the house of Saul or Jonathan that's alive? And someone says, well, by the way, there is. There's this nurse that took Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, and he's still alive. Can't walk, but he's still alive. So David calls for Mephibosheth. Now, do you remember what conquering kings usually do to the people that they conquered? Anybody that was part of the previous regime, part of the previous king's family, generally, the conquering king killed all the king's family. So if Mephibosheth comes to David, and he's afraid. In fact, look at what is said here in verse 7, or verse 6. Now, I'm in chapter 9, I'm sorry. Now, when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face and bowed or prostrated himself. Then David said to Mephibosheth, and he answered and said, here is your servant. And notice what David said. Do not be afraid. For I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan, your father's sake, and will restore you to all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table. Then he bowed himself and said, what is your servant that you should look upon him as such a dead dog as I? Here's Mephibosheth and how he looks at himself. I got nothing to bring. David's not going to get anything from Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth can't give David anything. You know, Jordan's been doing a great job on Sunday, the last 2 Sundays, talking about grace. Grace can also be described as loving kindness, beneficent acts, or graciousness. And all of those are present here. Here is a living illustration of grace. Mephibosheth had nothing to bring. He had nothing he could give David, but out of loving kindness, out of a really generous heart, out of a graciousness, David says to Mephibosheth, listen, you're going to be like my son. And by the way, all the land that was your father, your grandfather's, I've got that, it's yours. You take it, it's yours. And by the way, you shall sit at my table as well. You shall eat at my table. Do you see the graciousness of David toward Mephibosheth? Now remember, he's Jonathan's son. And do you remember what Jonathan and David had agreed to do? They had agreed to take care of each other's family. And Jonathan protected David when Saul was after him. And now David is making good on his promise to Jonathan. See, I told you, he's also loyal. He's loyal to a friend. Here he was loyal to God. But notice, loyal to here, Jonathan and Saul. Notice he's loyal again to Mephibosheth. Here you see the act of a true friend. He begins loyal to Jonathan and Saul, and he ends loyal to Mephibosheth. That's why we have a heart. Miss Jody drew a heart for me on both ends there. Mephibosheth is really an illustration of us, because we got nothing to bring to God. We got nothing to offer. We're bankrupt. We are completely empty. We have, at one time, if we knew what we were doing, we walked away from God, and out of his graciousness, out of his loving kindness, out of his generous acts of kindness toward us, out of his mercy, out of his grace, as David told Mephibosheth, you can put your feet under my table. So we are invited to the Lord's table, and he tells us we can put our feet under his table. That's grace that Jordan's been talking about. And Mephibosheth is an illustration of that. But there's one other act of grace. In the first part of chapter 10, last part of chapter 10 doesn't end so well. But the first part of chapter 10 is you have the king of the people of Ammon died. And the king of Ammon had been good to David, been kind to him and done many generous things for him. And so his son Hanun takes the throne. And so David thinks, hey, this guy's father's been good to me, so I tell you what, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach out. I'm going to do what I can to help him. And so I'm going to send a group of men over here to help him. And if they whatever they need, we're going to give them because his father was good to me too. Well, that act of grace and graciousness was misunderstood, to say the least, because there were some princes of the people of Ammon, and I take that to be some young advisors of Hanun, who said, hey, watch it. He's going to take advantage of you. They're going to come in, and they're going to clean us out. And they convinced the people to do some very mean things to the men that David had sent. At first, David doesn't do anything. But then these guys, they hire some mercenaries, the Syrians, and the battle's on. And because of their poor advice, thousands of people lost their life. If there'd just been some good advice, this wouldn't have happened. It didn't have to happen. But David, again, reaches out to Hanun, the king's son, as an act of grace. And so you see David's graciousness. Do you see all the way through this, David's loyalty? But now let me talk about the other side of this just a moment. And we won't exaggerate, won't really stress the point too much. And that is the misplaced loyalty. The Amalekite, back in chapter 1, his loyalty was misplaced because it was like Abner, what's in it for me? When Abner appoints Ishbosheth the king, he really is going to be the puppet, and Abner's going to be the power behind the throne. Until he does something wrong, and Ishbosheth calls his hand on it, and then Abner decides to go to David. And Abner's disposition is, what's in it for me? Abner makes a deal with David, hey, I'll sign the peace treaty with you. But he's not the king. Ishbosheth is. I'll make a treaty with you. We'll have peace. And David says, okay, if you bring my wife Michal with you. And remember, that was Saul's daughter, and Saul got upset with David, so he gave his daughter to Paltiel, and Paltiel didn't have any right to her. She was still rightfully David's wife. But Abner's disposition in all this is, what's in it for me? And that was the Amalekite. And I think that was also Benah and Rechab. What's in it for me? They were not loyal to anybody. They were loyal to themselves. They had no loyalty to God. They had no loyalty to David, no loyalty to anybody else except for themselves. You see that with Joab, with Abner. Because the battle takes place, and Joab, Abishai, and his brother Asahel fight Abner's army. At first, Abner and Joab are kind of sitting across the table, chewing the fat, talking about how the army is going to be. and then they send out some representatives, and they kill each other, and then the battle's on. Well, Asahel was a fast-running guy, and Abner's leaving the battle, and Asahel doesn't have any weapons, and so Asahel pursues Abner, and Abner says, "Look, buddy," tells him twice, "Please don't do this. Go back. Don't keep chasing me. Go back. Please don't do this." But Asahel wouldn't listen to him, and so Abner took his life. Whoa, time out. Joab hears about that. And so Joab doesn't know David's made this pact of peace with Abner, and he kills Abner out of revenge. This had nothing to do with God. It had nothing to do with the ark. It had nothing to do with the house of God. It had nothing to do with God. Joab is the captain of David's army, and he's out for one thing. As you did to my brother, so I'm going to do to you. That's a misplaced loyalty. The Amalekite had a misplaced loyalty. His loyalty was to himself. Abner had a misplaced loyalty. His loyalty was what's in it for me. Benah and Rechab had a misplaced loyalty. What's in it for me. The Philistines had all their idols, and they had a misplaced loyalty. Instead of giving their loyalty to God, they gave their loyalty to idols. And in fact, back in chapter 5 and verse 21, when David had to defeat them, they left their images there, and David is being carried them away. The implication of that is, from Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 25, is they destroyed them. Deuteronomy 7 and 5. They destroyed those golden images, those idols. The Philistines did not have a loyalty to God. And now we come to the Ark of the Covenant. And we see, again, a misplaced loyalty. The one time in this story that David has a misplaced loyalty. His intentions are right. But here again, now in chapter 7, chapter 7, chapter 7, he doesn't inquire of God, but he has God's interest at heart. Here, David simply wants the Ark of the Covenant back in Jerusalem, and he takes several thousand men with him, and they begin to go get the Ark of the Covenant. And so he takes 30,000 men to go to Kiryat Jearim to get this Ark of the Covenant, bring it back, and they don't carry it the right way. David set this whole thing up. He set this whole thing up. If he'd have stopped and said, "Let me inquire of the Lord how we ought to do this," he would have said, "Well, remember, you're supposed to have 2 poles going through, and the men of Kohath are supposed to carry it. You're supposed to have shoulder pads here. They're not supposed to touch it." Nope, that's not what happens. They make a cart, and they're going through a rough stretch of ground, and the cart begins to stumble and tip, and Uzzah reaches up and touches it. Good intentions, but not the way God said to carry the ark. A misplaced loyalty at that time. In fact, as a result of Uzzah being struck dead, David said, "Whoa, we're not going any further with this. I tell you what, we'll leave this in the house of Obed-Edom." Now, since the Philistines have had it, they've had a plague over every city and all the people of the Philistines because they have it. And now David's saying, "Whoa, if this is what happens when Uzzah touches it, we're going to leave it in the house of Obed-Edom." And then I'm wondering how they put it there. Did they pay attention to how they carried it? It doesn't tell us. But the house of Obed-Edom flourishes. And David said, "Oh, okay, good. It's a good thing. We can bring it to Jerusalem now." And so he follows through on that. I think another piece of misplaced loyalty was Michal. Because when David brings the Ark of the Covenant, he wears an ephod, which was not the crown of the prince, but that which was to be for a priest, though David's not a priest. And Michal's upset about him and said he danced like one of those vain fellows. And the point about that is, the way you're acting, you're not acting like a king, and it's making me look bad. And as a result of that, she's not able to bear children. A misplaced loyalty. She should have rejoiced with David. She should have been out there jumping up and down and screaming like all the other people were, rejoicing that the ark has come back, but instead she is sulking. Well, he's not acting like a king, he's making me look like a fool too. And then finally, with a displaced loyalty, I would say the men of Hanun, if those princes had just stopped to ask what the intentions of the men from David were all about, that battle could have been avoided and the loss of those men. Now, I want to talk just a moment, not going to really draw this out too long, but some qualities of loyalty. Loyalty is an essential quality in any close relationship. You see that with Jonathan, you see that with God, you see that with Mephibosheth, you see that with the ark, and you see that with the house of God. Loyalty, a loyal relationship is supportive. A loyal person will reach out when there is a need. They care. Who did David reach out for? He reached out for Mephibosheth. He reached out to care for Saul and Jonathan. A loyal relationship is respectful. If someone talks about someone behind their back, a loyal person won't do that. A loyal person will be respectful, just as respectful away from you as they are in your presence. David said, "You have touched God's anointed." They were not concerned about loyalty. Joab wasn't concerned about loyalty. Benaiah and Rechab weren't concerned about loyalty. They had no loyal, respectful relationship for David, for God, or for others. A third thing, a loyal relationship is trustworthy. In a relationship, a loyal person loves you fully and completely and will do nothing to harm you. Wait a minute. Rechab and Benaiah and Rechab do nothing to harm you. They had no loyalty to Ishbosheth. And again, had no loyalty to David either. The Amalekite had no loyalty. No loyalty to David, no loyalty to Saul or Jonathan. In fact, none of these had any loyalty to God. A loyal relationship is trustworthy. Fourth, a loyal relationship is sincere. A loyal person is always a sincere person. They practice random acts of kindness. David with Mephibosheth, and the attempted kindness with the men of Hanun. And then finally, a loyal relationship has integrity. When one does what is right by their own personal values and morals, that's integrity. They're kind, they're respectful, they're sincere, they're supportive, they're trustworthy. Personal loyalty is displayed through love, devotion, dedication, and commitment to the well-being of another. David with Jonathan and Saul. David with God. David with the presence of God. David with the house of God. And David with Mephibosheth. Do you see in all this? David is an example of loyalty. And David is the kind of example of loyalty that you and I want to have. We could do no better than to model the loyalty of David towards Saul, who'd been trying to kill him. And yet here's Jonathan, the man that he loved. His love for him was greater than love for a woman. You see that in a song that David writes about Jonathan. His loyalty for God, to inquire of God. His loyalty to seek God's counsel. His loyalty to bring the ark back. Well intentioned, wrong way to do it. But he wants the presence of God in the city of God. And then he wants the house built for God. He is loyal to a friend even though the friend is no longer living, because he takes care of his son. Can you imagine what it was the next meal when the sons of David are come? Here you got Ammon, here you got Absalom, here you got Adonijah. They all come to sit down at the table, and there's one more plate set. And here you hear the clinking and the clanging coming down the hallway because he can't walk real well, if at all. And Mephibosheth pulls himself up and seats himself right by the sons of David and eats at his table. Well, we come kicking and clanging to God because we can't walk on our own. And he said, the table's set for you. Now, one last thing. I put a peg somewhere. I want to go back and pick that up. I talked about David inquired of God. Now, obviously, with the Ark of the Covenant, he didn't do that. And with that building of the temple, he didn't do that, but he was looking for God, looking toward God. And he was really looking toward God in the Ark of the Covenant, too. David inquired of God. Now, I don't know how your Bible is. My Bible for 2 Samuel ends at chapter 10. Does your Bible end at chapter 10? My Bible ends at chapter 10. That's the end of the story of David. He defeats the Syrians. David's victorious. David rides off in the horizon, victorious, having defeated the Philistines, having defeated these Syrians. His wealth is immense. His power is immense. His strength is immense. My Bible ends at 2 Samuel 10. Well, I wish it ended at 2 Samuel 10. Because here's the sad thing. Out of all we said about the loyalty of David, after 2 Samuel chapter 10, all that is threatened, and David has trouble for the rest of his life. Because, as you're going to see in the study next week, he does something that has no loyalty to God, no loyalty to a friend, and he does not respect innocent blood. In fact, he sets the table for innocent blood to be taken. Jordan was talking to me on Tuesday, and we were talking about the lesson. And he said he'd been going over the lesson with the kids. And he said Benjamin told him something, and I think it was really profound for such a little fellow. He said, Appa, I sure liked David better when he was a boy. Well, I agree with Benjamin. I liked David better when he was a lot younger. Because the longer he served as king, the worse it got. David never has another peaceful moment after chapter 10. Not another peaceful moment. And that's what happens when even a man that is said to be after God's own heart departs from his loyalty to God and his loyalty to integrity, his loyalty to support, his loyalty to be respectful, his loyalty to be trustworthy. David sacrifices his loyalty and doesn't have another peaceful moment the rest of his life. So, my Bible doesn't end at chapter 10. No, it doesn't. But I tell you what, I sure wish it did. Because I'd like that story of David a whole lot better than what we're fixing to see. But I think there's a reason we have the rest of that story. And Jordan will be with you next week to help you see that. And I hope you can see us on Sunday. Jordan will continue at 9 o'clock with his series on grace. I'm going to continue at the 11 o'clock hour with the second lesson on what is the wise thing to do. And we're going to look at that. And so I hope you can be with us. We're doing all we can to try to keep things safe. We're doing all we can to try to respect one another. We're doing all we can to be gracious with one another. We're doing all we can to be kind to one another. We're doing all we can to have a generous heart toward one another. You see, all those things, as we said, are grace. We're just asking people to come put their feet under the Lord's table. Well, that's all for tonight. I love you. Joe and I love you. And just keep in mind, our arms are spread out wide for you. We can't wait to see you all. And I sure hope you can join us Sunday. If you're not yet comfortable and feel safe, then I hope you'll stream with us and stay in touch. Take care. Have a good night. Stay safe.